The golden morning light filtered through the ancient windows of Windsor Castle when Prince William discovered the documents that would shake the very foundations of the British monarchy. Hidden beneath centuries of royal protocol and carefully guarded secrets, a single leather-bound folder contained evidence so explosive that it would rewrite history itself. The heir to the throne stood frozen, his hands trembling as he read words that revealed the truth about Queen Camilla's past, words that would force him to make the most difficult decision of his life. In the corridors where kings once walked and queens once ruled, William faced a choice that would either preserve the crown's integrity or tear his family apart forever. The weight of duty pressed against his shoulders like the ancient stone walls surrounding him, while loyalty to his late mother's memory burned in his heart like an unextinguishable flame. What he held in his hands was more than just evidence. It was the power to strip away decades of carefully constructed royal narrative and expose secrets that powerful people had killed to protect. The question wasn't whether he had the authority to act on this information. The question was whether he had the courage to use it, knowing that once he opened this door, there would be no turning back. The clock tower chimed 9 times, marking not just another hour, but the moment when the future King of England would either become a guardian of uncomfortable truths or the architect of the monarchy's most devastating scandal in modern history. The morning started like any other at Kensington Palace, with Prince William reviewing correspondence from various Commonwealth nations while Catherine prepared their children for school. The routine comfort of family life had become his anchor in the turbulent waters of royal duty, especially after the challenging years following his father's coronation and Camilla's elevation to queen consort. Yet today would prove that even the most carefully maintained royal schedules could be shattered by a single telephone call. Sir Marcus Pemberton, the elderly palace historian, rarely contacted the royal family directly. His decades of service had been marked by discretion and an almost obsessive dedication to maintaining the crown's archives. When his voice crackled through William's private line, trembling with an urgency that seemed foreign to his usually measured tone, the prince immediately sensed something extraordinary was unfolding. "Your Royal Highness, I must speak with you immediately," Marcus had whispered, his words barely audible above the static. "I've discovered something in the archives that requires your immediate attention. Something about Her Majesty that changes everything we thought we knew." The historian's request to meet in the restricted section of the Royal Archives at Windsor Castle struck William as unusual, but the genuine fear in the old man's voice compelled him to clear his morning schedule. As he drove through the familiar gates of Windsor, William couldn't shake the feeling that this seemingly ordinary Tuesday was about to become a turning point in his life. The Royal Archives occupied a temperature-controlled wing of Windsor Castle that few people ever entered. Row upon row of climate-controlled cabinets housed centuries of royal correspondence, official documents, and state papers that chronicled the rise and fall of dynasties. The air smelled of old leather and preservation chemicals, creating an atmosphere that seemed to whisper secrets from ages past. Marcus waited in the deepest section of the archives, surrounded by documents that dated back to the Tudor period. His usually immaculate appearance seemed disheveled, as if he had spent the entire night poring over papers. Dark circles under his eyes suggested he hadn't slept, and his hands shook slightly as he gestured toward a leather portfolio lying open on the research table. "Your Royal Highness," Marcus began, his voice heavy with the weight of revelation, "what I'm about to show you will challenge everything the public believes about Queen Camilla's background. These documents were sealed and filed incorrectly decades ago, buried so deep in the archives that they've remained hidden until yesterday when I was conducting routine cataloging for the new digital preservation project." William approached the table with growing apprehension. The documents spread before him appeared to be a mixture of government correspondence, intelligence reports, and personal letters. Some bore the official seals of various government departments, while others carried the distinctive watermarks of international agencies. The dates ranged from the late 1970s through the early 2000s, spanning the crucial years when Camilla Parker Bowles had first entered the royal circle. The first document that caught William's attention was a report from the Security Service, commonly known as MI5. The header indicated it was part of a routine background check conducted when Camilla's relationship with Prince Charles had become serious. What made William's blood run cold wasn't the existence of the report, but rather its contents and the classification level that suggested information had been deliberately omitted from the version he had previously seen. According to this unredacted version, Camilla's family history contained elements that had been carefully scrubbed from all public records. Her father, Major Bruce Shand, had indeed been a decorated war hero as publicly reported, but the document revealed connections to post-war intelligence operations that painted a very different picture of the family's activities during the 1950s and 1960s. More troubling was a series of financial records that traced payments made to various Shand family accounts from sources that the intelligence services had been unable to fully identify. The amounts were substantial, paid regularly over a period of nearly 2 decades, and originated from offshore accounts connected to organizations that MI5 had flagged as potentially problematic for national security reasons. William's hands trembled as he turned to the next section of documents. These were personal letters exchanged between Camilla and individuals whose names had been partially redacted, but whose identities could be inferred from contextual clues within the correspondence. The letters revealed relationships and commitments that predated her involvement with Prince Charles by several years, and suggested a level of international connection that had never been disclosed during any official vetting process. One letter, dated just months before Camilla's first marriage to Andrew Parker Bowles, contained references to the arrangement we discussed and the importance of maintaining our understanding regardless of public circumstances. The letter was signed with initials that Marcus had traced to a businessman with documented connections to several foreign intelligence services. The implications were staggering. If these documents were authentic, they suggested that Camilla's entry into royal circles hadn't been the romantic coincidence that history books recorded, but rather a carefully orchestrated insertion that served purposes beyond personal affection. The idea that someone with undisclosed foreign connections had been positioned to influence the British royal family struck at the very heart of national security concerns that had guided royal protocol for centuries. William found himself studying photographs that had never appeared in any authorized biography or official royal documentation. The images showed Camilla at various social gatherings throughout the 1970s and early 1980s. But her companions in these photographs were individuals who intelligence reports identified as persons of interest to multiple governments. The fact that these photographs existed at all suggested a level of surveillance that went far beyond routine security measures. Marcus had prepared a timeline that cross-referenced the documentary evidence with known events in Camilla's life and her developing relationship with Prince Charles. The pattern that emerged painted a picture of calculated positioning that spanned decades. Key moments in her romantic involvement with the future king coincided with specific intelligence operations and geopolitical events, in ways that stretched coincidence beyond credibility. The most damaging document was a memorandum from a senior intelligence official to the cabinet secretary, written shortly after Charles and Camilla's marriage. The memo expressed concerns about security clearances and recommended ongoing monitoring of communications between the new Duchess of Cornwall and several international contacts. The memo had been marked for regular review, but according to Marcus's research, no subsequent reports existed in the files, suggesting either a cover-up or a decision to cease monitoring for political reasons. William realized that he was looking at evidence of a security breach that had persisted for decades at the highest levels of government and the royal family. The woman who now held the title of Queen Consort had apparently maintained relationships and commitments that should have disqualified her from any position of influence within the monarchy. Yet these concerns had been buried, ignored, or deliberately overlooked by people whose duty was to protect the crown. The personal impact on William was devastating. This wasn't just about constitutional propriety or security protocols. This was about the woman who had in many ways replaced his mother in his father's affections and in the public's perception of the royal family. The thought that his mother's memory had been overshadowed by someone whose loyalty to the crown was questionable filled him with a rage that he struggled to contain. As he continued reading, William discovered correspondence that suggested ongoing communication between Camilla and her foreign contacts even after her marriage to Charles. The letters were coded in language that appeared innocent to casual readers, but contained references that intelligence analysts had flagged as potentially significant. The fact that these communications had continued unmonitored raised questions about who else might have been compromised by association. Marcus explained that he had spent weeks verifying the authenticity of every document, consulting with forensic experts and comparing the papers to known authentic examples from the same period. Every test confirmed what William was seeing. These documents were genuine, unaltered, and had been deliberately hidden from anyone who might have acted on their contents. The historian's voice grew even more grave as he explained the potential implications. If this information became public, it wouldn't just damage Camilla's reputation or create a scandal for the royal family. It would raise fundamental questions about the security of the British state and the effectiveness of the vetting processes that were supposed to protect the monarchy from foreign influence. The reverberations would extend far beyond Buckingham Palace to encompass the highest levels of government and intelligence services. William found himself facing a decision that no heir to the throne should have to make. He possessed information that demanded action, but any action he took would devastate his family and potentially destabilize the institution he was destined to inherit. The weight of duty pulled him toward disclosure and accountability, while family loyalty urged him to find a way to protect his father from the knowledge that his greatest love might also represent his greatest betrayal. The documents also revealed the extent to which various officials had been complicit in concealing this information. Names appeared throughout the files of civil servants, security officials, and even some members of the royal household, who had clearly been aware of concerns about Camilla but had chosen to remain silent. The conspiracy of silence had persisted across multiple governments and administrations, suggesting a level of institutional failure that went far beyond individual mistakes or oversights. As William prepared to leave Windsor Castle that afternoon, he carried with him not just photocopies of the incriminating documents, but the crushing realization that the monarchy he had spent his life preparing to lead was built on foundations far more fragile than he had ever imagined. The woman who would traditionally have guided him through the transition to kingship was now revealed as someone whose very presence in the royal family represented a security risk that had been hidden for decades. The drive back to Kensington Palace gave him time to process the magnitude of what he had learned. But no amount of reflection could diminish the stark reality that he now faced. He possessed the power to expose the truth, but using that power would require him to destroy his father's happiness and potentially trigger a constitutional crisis that could damage the monarchy for generations. That evening, as William watched his children play in the palace gardens, he realized that the decision he made in the coming days would determine not just the immediate future of the royal family, but the kind of monarchy his own children would inherit. The weight of that responsibility pressed down on him like the accumulated centuries of royal history, demanding that he choose between personal loyalty and institutional integrity in a way that would define his character as both a son and a future king. The sleepless night that followed William's discovery at Windsor Castle stretched endlessly as he wrestled with the implications of what he had learned. Catherine had noticed his unusual distraction during dinner, but years of royal training had taught him to maintain composure even when his world was crumbling beneath the surface. As she slept peacefully beside him, William stared at the ceiling, knowing that the comfortable certainties of their life together would soon be tested by forces beyond their control. By dawn, he had made his first crucial decision. The documents were too sensitive, and the implications too far-reaching for him to handle alone. He needed allies who possessed both the expertise to verify what Marcus had discovered and the discretion to ensure that any investigation remained completely confidential until he decided how to proceed. The challenge lay in identifying individuals who could be trusted with information that could topple governments and reshape the monarchy. His first call went to Sir James Whitmore, a retired intelligence officer, who had served the crown faithfully for over 3 decades before establishing a private security consultancy that specialized in protecting high-profile individuals from exactly the kind of threats that William now suspected had been ignored for years. James possessed the unique combination of technical expertise, unquestioned loyalty, and sufficient distance from current government operations to conduct an independent assessment of the documents. The meeting took place in a private dining room at a discreet club in St. James's, chosen specifically because its membership consisted entirely of individuals who understood the absolute necessity of confidentiality in matters affecting the royal family. James arrived carrying a leather briefcase that contained equipment capable of conducting preliminary authenticity tests on documents without damaging them, a skill set that had proven invaluable during his years of investigating threats against the crown. William's presentation of the evidence to James proved even more unsettling than his initial discovery. The retired intelligence officer examined each document with the methodical precision of someone who had spent decades distinguishing between genuine intelligence and sophisticated forgeries. His expressions grew increasingly grave as he worked through the timeline that Marcus had constructed, cross-referencing dates and names against his own extensive knowledge of intelligence operations from the relevant periods. After 3 hours of intensive examination, James delivered his preliminary assessment with the blunt honesty that had made him legendary within the intelligence community. The documents appeared authentic based on paper composition, ink analysis, and formatting consistency, with known examples from the same agencies and time periods. More troubling was his recognition of several names and operations referenced in the correspondence, details that would have been impossible to fabricate without access to classified information that remained secret decades after the events described. The security implications were even more serious than William had initially understood. James explained that the pattern of relationships and financial transactions revealed in the documents suggested what intelligence professionals would classify as a long-term penetration operation, designed to place an asset in a position where they could influence decision-making at the highest levels of government. The sophistication required to maintain such an operation over multiple decades indicated involvement by a major intelligence service with substantial resources and patience. James recommended expanding their investigation to include Sarah Chen, a forensic accountant who had previously worked with intelligence services to trace money laundering operations connected to state-sponsored activities. Her expertise in following complex financial trails across multiple jurisdictions would be essential for verifying the banking records that formed a crucial part of the evidence against Camilla. The meeting with Sarah took place at her secure offices in the City of London, where sophisticated electronic countermeasures ensured that their conversation could not be monitored by any outside parties. Her analysis of the financial documents revealed patterns that were even more damaging than the intelligence reports had suggested. The payments to Shan family accounts had continued for far longer than initially apparent, extending well into the period after Camilla's marriage to Prince Charles. More significantly, Sarah's investigation revealed that the offshore accounts funding these payments had connections to shell companies and trust arrangements that bore the hallmarks of intelligence service funding mechanisms. The amounts involved were substantial enough to provide significant financial security, but structured in ways that would be difficult to detect without sophisticated analysis of international banking records. The timing of certain payments coincided with specific political events and royal activities in ways that suggested a direct correlation between Camilla's access to sensitive information and the compensation she received. Sarah's most disturbing discovery involved recent financial activity that indicated the payments might still be continuing through even more sophisticated mechanisms. Electronic transfers between various accounts showed patterns that suggested ongoing financial relationships with the same networks that had originally funded the Shan family, but now structured through investment vehicles and business partnerships that would be virtually impossible to detect through conventional auditing processes. The implications were staggering. If Sarah's analysis was correct, Queen Camilla had potentially been receiving compensation from foreign intelligence services throughout her entire relationship with the royal family, including the period after her marriage when she had gained access to state secrets and confidential government briefings. The scope of potential intelligence compromise extended far beyond personal relationships to encompass state policy and national security decisions. William realized that he needed legal advice from someone who understood both constitutional law and national security statutes. Sir Robert Maxwell, a Queen's Counsel who had previously served as legal advisor to the Security Service, possessed the expertise necessary to assess the legal implications of the evidence they had gathered. His reputation for absolute discretion and his extensive knowledge of the intersection between royal prerogatives and national security law made him the ideal consultant for this unprecedented situation. The legal consultation took place at Sir Robert's chambers in Lincoln's Inn, where the weight of centuries of legal tradition seemed appropriate for discussions that might reshape the constitutional relationship between the monarchy and the British state. Robert's analysis of the evidence was thorough and methodical, examining not only the potential criminal implications, but also the constitutional questions that would arise if the information became public knowledge. From a legal perspective, the evidence suggested potential violations of the Official Secrets Act, possible charges related to foreign agency relationships, and constitutional questions about the validity of Camilla's position within the royal family. More troubling was Robert's assessment that the statute of limitations had not expired for many of the activities documented in the files, meaning that criminal prosecution remained a possibility if the evidence was presented to appropriate authorities. The constitutional implications were equally complex. Robert explained that while the monarch's spouse did not hold an official government position, the Queen Consort's access to confidential briefings and her influence on royal decision-making created a unique legal situation. If foreign intelligence services had indeed maintained a relationship with someone in that position, it would represent an unprecedented breach of constitutional safeguards that had protected the monarchy for centuries. Robert's most sobering conclusion concerned the potential consequences of disclosure. The evidence was strong enough to trigger criminal investigations, parliamentary inquiries, and possibly even questions about the legitimacy of Charles's reign if it could be proven that his marriage had been influenced by foreign intelligence operations. The resulting constitutional crisis could destabilize not only the British monarchy, but also the governmental structures of every Commonwealth realm that recognized the British crown. As William absorbed the legal analysis, he began to understand that his decision would affect far more than his immediate family. The evidence he possessed could trigger investigations that would expose decades of security failures, potentially compromise ongoing intelligence operations, and create diplomatic crises with allied nations whose own intelligence services might be implicated in the conspiracy of silence that had protected these secrets. The investigation team's final meeting brought together all of their findings in a comprehensive assessment that painted an even more disturbing picture than William had initially feared. The convergence of documentary evidence, financial records, and legal analysis created an irrefutable case that Queen Camilla had maintained inappropriate relationships with foreign intelligence services throughout her association with the royal family. James presented a timeline that showed how information available to Camilla had been correlated with intelligence activities by foreign services, suggesting that her access to royal communications and government briefings had been systematically exploited. Sarah's financial analysis revealed the sophisticated mechanisms through which compensation had been provided over decades, while Robert's legal assessment confirmed that criminal charges were not only possible, but likely if the evidence was presented to prosecuting authorities. The weight of this knowledge pressed down on William as he realized that he now possessed information that could destroy his family, while simultaneously fulfilling his duty to protect the crown and the British state. The woman he had learned to accept as his stepmother, who had brought happiness to his father's later years, was revealed as someone whose loyalty to the British crown was fundamentally compromised by relationships that predated and superseded her royal obligations. William understood that the investigation phase of this crisis was complete. He possessed unambiguous evidence of security breaches that had persisted for decades at the highest levels of the royal family and government. The sophisticated nature of the operation suggested involvement by a major intelligence service with the resources and patience necessary to maintain such a complex penetration over multiple decades. The financial evidence proved ongoing compensation that continued to the present day, while the legal analysis confirmed that criminal prosecution was not only possible, but legally mandated, if the evidence was presented to appropriate authorities. The burden of decision now rested entirely on his shoulders. He could present the evidence to the proper authorities and trigger investigations that would expose the truth, but destroy his family and potentially destabilize the monarchy itself. Alternatively, he could attempt to manage the situation quietly, forcing Camilla's removal from royal duties without public disclosure of the reasons, though such action would still create enormous personal and political upheaval. As William prepared to leave Sir Robert's chambers, he carried with him the knowledge that the next phase of this crisis would require him to choose between competing loyalties that went to the very heart of his identity. He was simultaneously a son who loved his father, a future king who owed absolute duty to the crown, and a citizen whose obligation to national security could not be ignored, regardless of personal cost. The drive back to Kensington Palace gave him time to consider the full magnitude of what he faced, but no amount of reflection could change the fundamental reality that his next decision would define not only his own character, but the future of the institution he was destined to lead. The comfortable certainties of royal life had been shattered by evidence that demanded action, regardless of the personal consequences that such action would inevitably bring. That evening, as William watched Catherine reading bedtime stories to their children, he realized that the investigation had accomplished its purpose by confirming his worst fears about the security implications of Camilla's presence in the royal family. The question now was whether he possessed the strength to act on that knowledge, knowing that doing so would irrevocably change everything he had believed about duty, loyalty, and the price of protecting the crown. The decision that would reshape the British monarchy was made not in the grand halls of Buckingham Palace or the ancient chambers of Windsor Castle, but in the quiet sanctuary of William's private study at Kensington Palace. 3 weeks had passed since his team of investigators had confirmed the devastating truth about Queen Camilla's hidden loyalties, and the weight of that knowledge had transformed him from a dutiful heir into something harder and more resolute. The comfortable illusions that had sustained royal protocol for decades were about to be shattered by a prince who had chosen duty to the crown over family harmony. The confrontation began with a carefully orchestrated series of meetings that would give William the leverage he needed while providing his father with an opportunity to handle the crisis quietly. His first step was scheduling a private audience with Sir Clive Alderton, the king's private secretary, whose decades of service had given him intimate knowledge of every skeleton in the royal family's collective closet. The meeting took place in the map room at Buckingham Palace, a location chosen specifically because its historical significance would remind both men of the gravity of their discussion. Sir Clive's reaction to the evidence was everything William had expected from a career civil servant who had spent decades protecting the monarchy from scandals that could damage its reputation. His face remained carefully neutral as he examined the documents, but the slight tremor in his hands and the way he unconsciously loosened his tie betrayed the magnitude of his internal shock. Here was proof of security breaches that had occurred under his watch, evidence of foreign intelligence penetration that he had failed to detect despite his responsibility for protecting the royal family from exactly such threats. The private secretary's first instinct was to find ways to contain the damage, to explore options that might neutralize the threat without destroying the institution he had served faithfully for so many years. He suggested that the evidence might be handled through quiet diplomatic channels, that foreign intelligence services could be warned off through back-channel communications, and that Camilla's access to sensitive information could be gradually restricted without public explanation. William's response revealed how profoundly the investigation had changed his perspective on royal duty and institutional loyalty. The prince who had once been willing to overlook family complications for the sake of harmony was gone, replaced by someone who understood that the monarchy's survival depended on its ability to maintain the trust of the British people. Quiet containment was no longer sufficient when the security of the state had been compromised for decades by someone at the very heart of the royal family. The evidence demanded action that went far beyond diplomatic face-saving or gradual restrictions on access. William made clear that he intended to present his father with an ultimatum that would force immediate and decisive resolution of the crisis. Queen Camilla would be stripped of all royal titles and removed from any position that provided access to state secrets, or the evidence would be presented to the appropriate authorities for criminal prosecution and public disclosure. Sir Clive's attempts to negotiate alternative solutions revealed the depth of institutional resistance to confronting uncomfortable truths about royal security. He spoke of the damage that public disclosure would cause to the monarchy's reputation, the potential for constitutional crisis, and the personal devastation that such action would bring to King Charles. These were the same concerns that had allowed the security breach to persist for decades. The same institutional priorities that had placed royal comfort above national security. William's refusal to accept these arguments marked a fundamental shift in how the monarchy would approach its responsibilities to the British state. The future king made clear that the institution he would inherit must be one that could withstand scrutiny, precisely because it operated according to the highest standards of integrity and accountability. A monarchy that protected its reputation by concealing security breaches was ultimately more vulnerable than one that addressed such problems decisively, regardless of short-term embarrassment. The meeting with his father was scheduled for the following morning at Clarence House, in the private sitting room where Charles conducted his most sensitive personal business. William arrived carrying a leather portfolio that contained not only the evidence his team had gathered, but also a detailed proposal for handling the crisis that would minimize damage to the monarchy while ensuring that the security breach was permanently resolved. King Charles's reaction to his son's revelations progressed through the predictable stages of denial, anger, and desperate bargaining that William had anticipated. The man who had waited decades to assume the throne, who had endured years of public scrutiny over his relationship with Camilla, was being presented with evidence that his greatest personal happiness was built on a foundation of deception and potential treason. The king's initial response was to question the authenticity of the documents, to suggest that they might represent an elaborate attempt to undermine his marriage and destabilize his reign. William had prepared for this reaction by bringing Sir James Whitmore to the meeting, allowing the retired intelligence officer to explain the sophisticated verification process that had confirmed the document's authenticity. The technical details of paper analysis, ink composition, and cross-referencing with classified databases made denial impossible for anyone willing to accept objective evidence. Charles's anger when it came was directed not at Camilla, but at the son who had uncovered truths that threatened everything he held dear. The king accused William of pursuing a vendetta against his stepmother, of allowing his lingering loyalty to Princess Diana's memory to cloud his judgment about evidence that might have innocent explanations. The accusation struck at William's deepest vulnerabilities, forcing him to confront the extent to which his mother's death had shaped his perspective on royal duty and family loyalty. William's response to his father's anger revealed the strength of character that the investigation had forged in him. He acknowledged that his feelings about his mother's treatment had influenced his initial reaction to the evidence, but insisted that the security implications transcended personal emotions or family dynamics. The documents revealed potential treason, not merely marital complications, and his duty as heir to the throne required him to act on that evidence regardless of personal cost. The bargaining phase of their confrontation proved most dangerous to William's resolve, as Charles deployed every weapon in his considerable arsenal of emotional manipulation. The king spoke of his love for Camilla, of the happiness she had brought to his later years, and of the devastating impact that her public disgrace would have on his ability to serve as monarch. He painted pictures of constitutional crisis, of Republican movements gaining strength from royal scandals, and of the damage that such revelations would cause to the Commonwealth realms that looked to the British crown for stability. More personally, Charles reminded William of family obligations that went beyond constitutional duty. He spoke of the years when Camilla had been a supportive presence in the royal family, of her kindness to William's own children, and of the bonds that had developed despite the complicated circumstances of her entry into royal circles. The king's emotional appeals were designed to make William question whether protecting abstract concepts of national security was worth destroying the human relationships that had become central to the royal family's private happiness. William's resistance to these emotional arguments demonstrated the depth of his commitment to placing institutional integrity above personal comfort. He acknowledged the personal cost that his actions would impose on everyone involved, but insisted that the monarchy's survival depended on its ability to maintain the trust of the British people. That trust could not be preserved if foreign intelligence services maintained assets at the heart of the royal family, regardless of the personal relationships that had developed around those compromised positions. The critical moment of their confrontation came when William presented his father with the ultimatum he had prepared after weeks of careful consideration. Queen Camilla would voluntarily relinquish all royal titles and withdraw from any position that provided access to state secrets, accepting a face-saving explanation that attributed her decision to health concerns or personal choice. In exchange, the evidence of her intelligence relationships would remain confidential, protecting her from criminal prosecution while ensuring that the security breach was permanently resolved. The alternative was public disclosure of the evidence through appropriate legal channels, triggering criminal investigations that would expose the full extent of foreign intelligence penetration while creating the constitutional crisis that Charles feared. William made clear that he would not accept partial solutions or gradual transitions that might allow the security compromise to continue in modified form. King Charles's recognition that his son was prepared to follow through on this ultimatum marked the turning point of their confrontation. The king had expected to find the dutiful heir who had always deferred to paternal authority, but instead encountered someone who had been transformed by the weight of evidence into an implacable guardian of royal security. The comfortable family dynamics that had allowed previous problems to be managed through compromise and negotiation were no longer sufficient for threats of this magnitude. The negotiations that followed their initial confrontation consumed several days of intense discussion involving the most senior advisors in the royal household. Palace lawyers explored every possible legal framework for Camilla's removal that might minimize constitutional complications. Communications specialists developed strategies for managing public reaction to explanations that would necessarily be incomplete and potentially unconvincing. Security professionals assessed the implications of various approaches for protecting both the royal family and national intelligence operations that might be compromised by public disclosure. Throughout these discussions, William maintained unwavering pressure for decisive action, while his father sought alternatives that might preserve some vestige of the life he had built with Camilla. The Prince of Wales made clear that he would not be satisfied with cosmetic changes or temporary restrictions that left the fundamental security problem unresolved. His investigation had revealed a penetration operation of unprecedented sophistication, and eliminating that threat required complete severance of the relationships that had enabled it. The final resolution came when Camilla herself was presented with the evidence and the choices available to her. The confrontation between William and his stepmother took place in the presence of King Charles and Sir Clive Alderton, ensuring that there could be no later disputes about what had been said or agreed. William's presentation of the evidence was clinical and methodical, designed to make clear that denial or negotiation were not realistic options given the strength of the documentation his team had assembled. Queen Camilla's reaction to the evidence was revealing in ways that confirmed William's worst suspicions about her loyalty and integrity. Rather than expressing shock at the accusations or demanding explanations for how such misunderstandings might have occurred, she immediately began calculating the personal cost of various responses and seeking ways to minimize the damage to her own interests. Her primary concern appeared to be preserving her financial security and social position rather than addressing the national security implications of her documented relationships with foreign intelligence services. The negotiation of her departure from royal duties required William to demonstrate the same ruthless determination that had driven his investigation. Camilla's attempts to retain certain titles or maintain access to royal residences were rejected without consideration. Her proposals for gradual withdrawal that might allow her to maintain some public presence were dismissed as incompatible with the security requirements that her removal was designed to address. The final agreement stripped Queen Camilla of all royal titles and official positions, while providing her with a financial settlement that ensured comfortable private life away from any involvement in royal affairs. The public explanation attributed her withdrawal to personal health concerns that required her to step back from the demanding responsibilities of royal duty. Official statements emphasized the king's continued respect for her contributions to the monarchy and his understanding of her need to prioritize personal well-being over public service. Within 6 months of William's discovery at Windsor Castle, the constitutional crisis that had threatened to destroy the monarchy had been resolved through decisive action that protected national security while preserving institutional stability. The investigation had revealed foreign intelligence penetration at the highest levels of the royal family, but that threat had been eliminated through the complete removal of the compromised individual from any position of influence or access. The personal cost of this resolution fell most heavily on King Charles, who found himself isolated in a role that had already proven more demanding than his years of preparation had suggested. The removal of Camilla from his life created an emotional void that no amount of public duty could fill, transforming him into a more solitary figure whose dedication to royal service became his primary source of meaning and purpose. For William, the crisis had been a transformation that prepared him for the responsibilities of kingship in ways that no conventional training could have accomplished. The future monarch had learned that protecting the crown sometimes required actions that imposed devastating personal costs on those he loved most. The comfortable certainties of family loyalty had been replaced by a harder understanding of institutional duty that would guide his reign when the time came to inherit the throne. The monarchy that emerged from this crisis was stronger for having confronted and resolved a security threat that had persisted for decades. But it was also fundamentally changed by the recognition that royal privilege could not be allowed to compromise national security. William's actions had established precedents that would guide future monarchs in balancing personal relationships against institutional responsibilities, ensuring that the crown's survival would never again depend on concealing uncomfortable truths about those who served at its highest levels.